This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, loggers, and miners. Back in 1965, 60 years ago, the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. All right, let's go to line number one and welcome to the show, Justin Jackson. And what I love to do on this show is take a deep dive into history because you're supposed to learn from history. Not everybody does. And we often see history repeating itself. And our guest today, Justin Jackson, is a visiting lecturer at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And we're going to talk about primarily the histories of labor and war in the United States and how they're connected. Justin Jackson, welcome to America's Workforce. Thanks for joining us today. A little background on yourself first before we move on, because this is going to be, I could feel a fascinating conversation coming up. So I'm going to let you start off a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today. Go ahead, sir.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I'm a historian of labor in the United States and the world, and how it relates to war and U.S. foreign relations. I actually started out being really interested in labor issues as a young person. My family members were union members, but not active, sadly. And so I was interested in labor issues. And then 9/11 happened. And Afghanistan happened, and I think most significantly, the war in Iraq happened. And as a student, I kept on trying to think, well, how do these issues of work and working people's issues, dignity in the workplace, justice in the workplace, and the community, how do they relate to how America relates to the world? Right? What is the relationship between those two things? And I couldn't really figure it out. I mean, there's plenty of histories and studies about, say, the CIO in World War II and how the UAW related to the federal government and war production, or, there's studies of the American Federation of Labor during World War I and questions of how labor has kind of worked with the federal government on foreign relations. But I couldn't figure it out in the contemporary era. And then I saw a report about the conditions of foreign workers who are working for the U.S. military in the Middle East. Often not directly for the U.S. military, but for private contractors. Think Kellogg, Brown and Root, Halliburton, those big names of private military companies, private defense contractors. And reading about kind of the abuses that these folks face, their passports being sequestered, wages being denied. I realized that part of the story of war and labor is not about American workers and war, although that's really important, right? And we could talk about that, and I'm fascinated with it. But actually how war making rests on the labor of people outside the United States and Americans, especially in the 20th century, right? When we get a really powerful, well-resourced, organized, permanent military establishment, right? That we still have, even in this kind of neoliberal age, right? Where you have, Pete Hegseth and everyone else cutting the military in serious ways.
So talk to me about the relationship here, why war or military and foreign policy is something that workers and union members should care about, because we're in this stage right now, and you know what's going on. It's America first. We don't need to get involved in other countries. Ukraine, for one, we're seeing, but that seems to be changing now as well. But there's a large part of the population that they don't want to get involved in this. And I'm of the assumption that there's a lot of union brothers and sisters with that same attitude. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there's a kind of healthy skepticism and even kind of isolationism in America today, including with workers. And I get it. I understand it. I think it's totally reasonable. I think workers should care about war and American military and foreign relations because one, they're citizens, two, as citizens, or not citizens in some cases, they are paying taxes, right?
Right.
And our taxes go to those. So it directly interests us. And let's not even talk about conscription. We have an all volunteer force, obviously. But hey, God forbid, a war over Taiwan or something like that, if you're male and you're over 18, you're registered for selective service. So no matter what your income or background is, right? So it should interest us, and there is skepticism about it. But my interest with the question is there's a lot of labor movement people, a lot of people on the left who kind of assume workers should be internationalists, should relate to people in other countries as workers, right? That we have a common class identity. And there's something to that argument. We have common class interests. But as a historian, I'm interested in explaining, well, why does that not happen, right? Like, why don't working people in America necessarily relate to working people in Ukraine, right? Like, what is it about that? And I think there's some really interesting things to explain there, right? The labor movement, I have to say, used to be more internationalist, right? I mean, the CIO, the AFL-CIO used to be, I think, more cognizant of foreign relations issues, right, and foreign policy, because they were such a part of the Democratic Party establishment. And even when there were Republican administrations, right, unions were part of those conversations. And there was a real understanding that the fortunes of the labor movement in the United States had something to do with the fortunes of the labor movement outside of the United States, right? I think we've lost that a little in this backlash against globalization, in this backlash against which, again, is reasonable in many ways, and a backlash against an aggressive kind of foreign policy from the Bush years. But I think more importantly, it's a question of workers as being citizens, workers as being part of the nation, part of the United States. Right, we're more than just our identities at work. We're more than just collecting a paycheck. We're part of the nation, right? And so we should, I think, have a sense of kind of, well, what are our national priorities? How does it relate to the total amount of resources available for working people in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, there are political uses to war, right? Like when George Bush said, don't worry about the war on terror, just go shopping, right? Right? I mean, there are ways that war distracts and keeps us from thinking about kitchen table issues here in the United States, and there's political uses to that too, unfortunately. So I think it's very much something that workers should care about. I would say also what's been really interesting is to see how unions take different positions on the war in between Israel and Hamas, right, in Gaza, and see how that plays out. It's been kind of fascinating, a bit ugly at times, in some unions, but I think it shows that debate is useful for showing that a lot of unions do care about foreign relations and foreign policy, and that's, I think, overall that's a good thing, right?
Yeah,
like it's good that workers and particularly unions remember that we're part of the United States and overall government policy, but more of that part of a global community, and what happens abroad often, not always, but often kind of rebounds and affects us at home.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Israel, because the UAW has been very, very vocal on that issue. And I want to take that back because I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. And at that time, I think, George Meany, and then there was Lane Kirtland running the AFL-CIO.
Yes.
Vietnam was going on.
Yes.
And there was which created a huge, huge political divide in this country.
Yes.
Huge.
Yes.
And labor was involved in that as well. Have you done a deep dive into what happened back then?
Yeah. There's actually now some good historical scholarship with that, and I've got a real interest in the '60s myself, and have published a little on it, and talked to union people and people who are against the war, people who are not, and it's really interesting. I mean, I think that helps to kind of elaborate a bit what I'm talking about here, right? Like, most of the labor movement in the mid 60s, even the late 60s, was definitely on board with Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Democratic White House and the war in Vietnam. Most of the Democratic Party was, not only the Republican Party. And it's really when it became clear that you couldn't have guns and butter at the same time necessarily, right? And that all this federal spending on the war was beginning to cause inflation. You certainly see that by the early 70s. And Nixon has to start dealing with that with wage and price, price controls and things like that, right? The labor movement starts to split, right, on the question of Vietnam in some really interesting ways, right? In some ways, following Martin Luther King, right, and the civil rights movement breaking on Vietnam. And King was a labor man. I mean, King,
yeah,
people forget this about King. King was very much tied to, black workers and movements with the UAW helped sponsor the March on Jobs and Freedom, right? And so once that starts to happen, the UAW, Reuther start to swing, and a couple of other unions like the Longshoremen's Union and other things like that start to swing against the war. But again, war comes home. I mean, what does Nixon do in the early 70s? People might remember, right? There was this rowdy protest of construction workers in downtown New York City, right, against an anti-war protest. I believe this was 70 or 71, right? And Nixon kind of like brilliantly weaponized this against the anti-war movement. It became known as the hard hat protest, right? These construction workers just going at it with these long-haired, hippie types, in downtown New York. Right. And it was politically advantageous. I think you almost see sort of something like that today. Right. Like, I get it. There's a lot of young people, progressive people on the left, anti-war people, progressive Jewish Americans who are upset about Gaza. Right. And maybe should be. Right. Like, there's the way things are going there are terrible for both Israelis and Palestinians. But Trump and the people around him are brilliant at weaponizing student protest, right, and using it as a way to crack down on universities right now, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of dynamic that you see with Nixon and Vietnam in the 70s. Then turned against a New Deal liberalism that incorporated labor and workers, now against just like the Democratic Party, and all the kind of liberal institutions like academia that are part of it.
I knew this was going to be a fascinating conversation. Our featured guest today is Justin Jackson. He is a visiting lecturer at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. We'll continue the conversation. You mentioned MLK. Well, I talk a whole lot about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And what he said profoundly was the intertwining of civil rights and workers' rights. I want to talk about that next with you, okay? You're listening to America's Workforce. Back in a few minutes. Don't go away. By the way, this next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers and miners. Well, in 1965, the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families, for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
And don't forget, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. We're taking a deep dive into history and trying to dissect the histories of labor and war in the United States, how they're connected. And our featured guest is a visiting lecturer at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. That would be Justin Jackson. And his website, by the way, is justinjackson.com. And by the way, he's a former organizer with the United Auto Workers Local 2322 in Western Mass. Now, when did that happen, Justin? I assume that was a few years ago. Is that right?
It was a long time ago. It was before I went the professional historian route. I almost ran for president of the local. So, if I had done that and won, I'd probably be in a different line of work right now. But yeah, it was a great time. I organized, healthcare, health services workers, human services workers, teachers, and things like that. It's kind of like an interesting UAW local, mostly like, graduate students at UMass. The UAW has gone in all kinds of directions and been really good at organizing graduate students.
Well, they had to because of the devastation in the American auto industry, with all the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they had to. Steelworkers did the same thing.
I'm all for organizing.
Yeah,
for opportunistic organizing. Organize all the time, anywhere you can, anybody you can.
I want to go back to Martin Luther King Jr., and you mentioned him in the first segment here. And one thing that he always said was civil rights and worker rights are related. And think about that. What's happening today? An attack on civil rights and workers' rights. Again, here's history repeating itself. Although, civil rights and workers' rights, that's a perennial thing. They're always under attack. If you could talk about that, and obviously Martin Luther King was a visionary on that subject, and he had so many followers. We talk about him all the time. I mean, I can't talk. I mean, here's the guy that was standing up for striking sanitation workers the day before he was assassinated. I mean, he stood for workers and he stood for civil rights. Can you talk about that to our listeners?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Martin Luther King was the son of a minister, right? But when he was in New England doing his seminary training, he was working with, immigrant farm workers in the Connecticut River Valley who were picking tobacco, right? He always had this element of an awareness and a consciousness that struggles for racial equality, right, were linked to struggles for economic equality and opportunity. He always had that sense. And we tend to forget that, right? Because in our memory and the way we teach about and think about the civil rights movement, he becomes kind of hemmed in as this iconic civil rights figure. But he always saw the relationship between them. And the kind of the famous way of thinking about this is this one thing that, African Americans in the South could sit down at the same lunch counter at Woolworth's with white patrons. That's an important achievement. Don't get me wrong, that's great. But what if they don't have the money for the hamburger and the cup of coffee, right? Right? Like if you don't have a union, right, that gives you the power to negotiate and organize for better wages, for better working conditions, for dignity on the job and in the community, then civil rights is kind of like you could think of it as a kind of a false equality or a legal equality, but not lacking a substance, right, about your place in society and social equality. And so he always understood that. We also forget this. Sadly, when he was assassinated in 1968. What was he doing? He was helping a sanitation workers strike in Memphis. He was helping them organize and win a really, really difficult strike there. A couple of black sanitation workers, segregation is one of the few jobs open to them in Memphis, right? A couple of sanitation workers were injured and one, I think, was killed on the job, right, by a truck malfunctioning, right? And so he showed up and was assisting that struggle. He really was a proud supporter of the labor movement, not only in the South and the country. And towards the end of his life, he made that transition. Again, he broke with the Democratic Party over the war in Vietnam. And he started to realize, if we're going to really have a war on poverty, right, help not only workers who are organized, but workers who are unorganized, have a movement of the poor, much like, that has inspired Bill Barber in North Carolina, the Poor People's Movement, right, which is an important movement, I think, for labor to pay attention to. If we're going to dedicate some resource to those folks and lifting them up, you cannot have billions of dollars going to, fighter jets and bombs and a war overseas that's unnecessary, right? And so, Martin Luther King deserves a lot of credit, I think, for realizing that the fortunes of the poor, the fortunes of working people in America are intimately linked to the choices that the federal government makes about America's place in the world. But I would say, it's not just him. You go back even before Martin Luther King. Go to the early CIO, right? And this idea that a war against fascism, right, means a war for working people, right? Like, we can't just sit on our butts here and think that what goes on in Europe or what goes on in Asia won't come back to us, right? Think about this: if Russia today, if Vladimir Putin takes over Ukraine, and in theory, if he takes over other places, well, those are fewer trading partners for the United States, right? That means less exports. That means less jobs here, right? Like, eventually, when we carve up the world into spheres like this, it's gonna affect the economy in the United States, right? And you go all the way back to the early labor movement, the industrial workers of the world, for example. This was a union that said, like, all workers across the world have common interests. We need to organize everywhere, right? Even go back before that, right? During the American Civil War, there was a sense that, the South was going to win that war by getting Great Britain, which bought all the cotton from the South, right, to come in on the Southern side, right? Well, what did Northern workers do? They created ties with English textile workers. And eventually, English textile workers, some of whom were anti-slavery, said, you know what? We're never going to support England coming in on the side of the Confederacy. And that was kind of a common tie between workers, right? So I think, we have these moments in American history where workers have a kind of, how would you say, like a cosmopolitan consciousness. They're aware that they're part of the world, right? And what happens out there affects us in here. But I think it comes in waves. We have these moments where we're more aware of it than at other times, I think.
All right, there's two things that came up in what you just said: Civil War and fascism. All right. Now, there's many that are concerned that America is on the verge of a civil war. The political divide. What's going on in this country. And it's gotten violent in some circles. Fascism. There's many of the opinion that this administration is going in that direction. Okay, I just threw you a whole lot of fodder there, buddy. And I'm sure some of this comes up when you're doing your lectures at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So what do you think?
Oh boy, does it ever. You just tossed me a couple of live hand grenades there. Yeah, I'm really obsessed with the American Civil War. I just taught a course at UMass on the Civil War, and wow, what a moment we're living through. I mean, we are a deeply politically polarized country. And I think, the decade that most reminds me of kind of where we are is definitely the 1850s. The decade before the American Civil War broke out. Political violence, a deep sense of radical political difference between people, where people couldn't even agree on the facts, much less like questions of policy. I think talk of Civil War tends to be more on the right than on the left. But I think it's important for the left to remember there's a constant civil war in the society, if you can think of it kind of metaphorically, and that's the war between capital and labor. There's always conflict between capital and labor, right? And so that's always going on. I think the interesting question is how does it relate to politics? How does it relate to politics? And I think Trump and MAGA has done a really good job of speaking to the really reasonable frustration that working people have in the United States with the economy and the direction of the economy. He's been really, really good at it. The problem is there's anti-democratic elements like in the MAGA movement, right? Like you have to really ask, well, what kind of democracy does, a billionaire real estate developer want for America? What kind of democracy does Elon Musk want for America? Is that the same kind of democracy that the UAW members in Ypsilanti want for America? I'm not so sure, right? And so there's those real serious questions. Now, the fascism question, that's a whole other layer and complication. I tend to think that that's more interesting as a historical comparison. I don't think we're really dealing with fascism. I think I do think, what the resemblance is this kind of anti-democratic, or even you might call it kind of authoritarian element. When the government is sending National Guard troops, to corral, some protest against the wishes of the state governor, that's the kind of behavior that we used to see used against the labor movement, against strikes, right? Like earlier in the 20th century, right? Where the federal government comes in and crack down, on the American Railway Union and the Pullman strike in 1894, or the Colorado miners' strike, right? Where you send in the National Guard. It doesn't matter what local communities want. That's this kind of anti-democratic, anti-worker, anti-working class behavior, that I think, that kind of stuff is scary, where you start to have the rules that typically keep this rust bucket together start to break down. Folks, I say this all the time. There's no law of history that says, labor unions will get stronger and stronger and more stable over time. As we see, union density, right, has diminished, right? The power of unions has. Well, the same is true with American democracy. There's no historical law that says the American democracy will last forever. It doesn't have to. It might not, right? And people have to be aware of that, right?
Yep.
and aware that working people's lives and their institutions, especially their unions, are linked to the democracy, and the democracy is linked to their fate. They're connected, right? I don't think you can have one without the other.
Boy, you did a good job after I threw those hand grenades at you.
Trying to juggle those. Those are explosive questions, my friend. Yeah. Wow.
No, you did well. You did well, and I appreciate your comments and your passion on this whole subject. This is exactly the kind of conversation we want to have, especially as we go into the Labor Day weekend. Justin Jackson, who is a visiting lecturer at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, do check him out online. JustinJackson.com. JustinJackson.com. You take care. And I have a feeling you and I are going to have a conversation in the not too distant future. Okay, brother?
Oh, I would love to be back on the show. Good to meet you, brother.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferenc.